You know, the article has not been written yet, linking directly mixed methods research and humanitarian research strategies. So we are tying together two areas here, perhaps for the first time. That doesn't mean there haven't been some mixed methods articles in the humanitarian area, and certainly the disaster area, disaster relief area, but basically putting a mixed methods overlay over that research process. I know in the American Evaluation Association, there's an interest group on mixed methods research that's over 300 strong right now. And the evaluators have always felt they've been doing kind of mixed methods, but not maybe as systematic as the mixed methods researchers are talking about it today. And so really mixed methods is a tool with some specific strategies that if you use it in an evaluation or a monitoring and assessment context, I believe will give you a much better understanding of the data that you have, the responses, ways to engage your stakeholders, ways to picture your project, ways to design your study. It's going to give you all of these strategies to add to a toolkit that can be used to do a better evaluation, I think. And on my background, I was trained as a quantitative researcher and then moved over to qualitative and then added on mixed methods research. So some of my books, this looks at quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research, and this is a qualitative book. And this reviews 11 approaches to research. So, and this is the mixed methods book that I tend to use in workshops today. Here's a reader of different mixed methods journal articles, and this is a book which is kind of the baby version of the blue book here, Understanding Research. The thing about the way I think about research is I like putting project designs side by side. Very early on, I wasn't content just to think as a quantitative researcher. I wanted to see how qualitative might differ from that. And then further, how the two might be combined to form mixed methods research. And the interesting thing about mixed methods of research is that it's a very intuitive process. First of all, it's bringing together people that have more of a quantitative orientation, qualitative. So I see myself kind of bridging across different areas, making them more accessible to many people. But it's very intuitive. Now I'm going to give you an example here, and I hope I don't re-traumatize any of you. It could be traumatizing what I'm going to go into next. And that's not my intent, but you'll see what my intent is to illustrate mixed methods research here. The basic question is, what evidence do we draw to make sense of this world we're in? Whether we're in the Congo, whether we're here in Massachusetts, whether we're at any place in the world, what is the evidence that we're using? And I'm going to use an illustration that's very close to home here. The Boston Marathon bombing. And this is a picture of some of the runners that were in the Boston Marathon race. That day, it was about 50 degrees here in Boston, 23,000 runners, $806,000 of prize money. So you can see why runners came from all over the world. It's quite an amount of money here. 71 countries were represented. Almost 3/4 finished the race. Of course, I think to get in the Boston Marathon, you need to qualify. So perhaps that number is not surprising. There were a number of hand cycle contestants. You know what the hand cycle is? Over there. Oops. Then also, there were 52 wheelchair contestants. Now, we know after the bombs went off, they went off in the afternoon at 2:50. 3 people were killed, 170 were wounded. Over here at Brigham, close by, there were 31 people taken there. Massachusetts General, there were 31. The Boston Medical Center, there were 23. In Beth Israel, there were 21. And there were 10 children taken to Boston's children that range from age 2 to 12. And one of the factors that I'm most proud of, since I'm working with Fong here and the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, is many of the first responders, the doctors, were from HHI. And so they were equipped to respond very quickly to this crisis because they've been doing it around the world. And there was an article that came across all of our notices from Harvard saying these first responders were so proud of HHI and what they've brought to helping save people's lives in this. Now, I was standing at the 24-mile marker. That morning, I decided not to go down to the finish line. Although, I'll have to say I don't like large crowds, so probably wouldn't have been my inclination to stand at the finish line. But if you know about a marathon race at mile 24, it's 2 miles before the finish. And this is when the runners are getting very, very tired and exhausted. And so what had gathered at this St. Paul and Beacon Street intersection was about 1,000 people, and I was one of them. And someone had some big speakers up, and they were blasting music. They were playing Sweet Caroline, and they were playing Chubby Checker's Shout, and that YMCA thing, you know, where you do your arms like this. These runners coming at mile 24 were actually smiling. Can you imagine 500 people singing Sweet Caroline together with the music blaring? These runners were smiling and laughing, and some of them were going like this when we did the YMCA thing. And of course, then, within a few minutes, the bombs went off. And so where I was standing at the 24-mile marker was no longer a place of happiness, thrilled with the race, people singing. It was filled with people that were walking back because they were turned around at mile 25, if you recall the details here. And they had those aluminum capes on, and they were literally walking back like this. Now, what I've just done to make sense of this world is I've given you the numbers. And then I've given you the personal experiences. And together, I've given you a mixed methods rendering of this bombing incident. Now, it's not a question of whether you got more involved when I went into my personal story. Some of you may have done that. Some of you may have found the statistics more interesting. It's the question of whether when we start putting qualitative and quantitative together, not keeping them separate, but together, we now have a greater understanding. Because if I just told you my story, it probably wouldn't have been as interesting without the facts of the statistics. Or if I gave you the statistics, it may not have been as interesting as the personal story. This is what's driving mixed methods, is that it's a popular thing that we're seeing every day. You can turn on CNN tonight, and you will see a mixed methods news reporting. Why? Because the meteorologists will give us the numbers about the humidity in Boston, and then they'll do some personal interviews. They're putting together the quantitative and qualitative. And that's what mixed methods is. It brings a more complete understanding to the picture than just one or the other. So in this program assessment impact area, we had the bulletin article that we sent out for you to take a look at. Expanding the scope of humanitarian program evaluation. And this came out, in, I think, 2007? So yes, 2007. And it's a mixed methods project. they talk about impact program evaluation by coming up with better standards and measures of health status, standardized measures in emergencies, improving on just looking at program outputs when you assess a humanitarian situation. They note that these different standards are expanding, that we need to know both the positive as well as the negative impacts. There's often the focus on the positive impacts. And they come up with this term, they suggest mixed qualitative and quantitative assessment methodology as a methodology for humanitarian assistance program evaluation. And then they provide 2 examples. They give this picture. They say the current evaluation practice looks like this. We do a quantitative assessment, and I assume that might be pre and post an intervention. And then they say, you know, but you could add qualitative data into this to have a little deeper understanding. So you start with a quantitative assessment, and then you collect some qualitative interviews by having people list things out. You analyze that data, and then you add it to the survey, and you're going to have a more context-based quantitative assessment. Now, the way they present this article, first of all, it's a good article. It's an interesting article. There are 2 examples, give us a little bit of detail about how these unintended consequences appeared in some projects, humanitarian projects. This is a start, but it's only one way to begin using qualitative data with quantitative data. And this is what mixed methods gives us. It gives us a range of possibilities for our toolkit beyond this. And I'm going to use some terms here. So I've tried to bridge across a little bit. Doing an assessment of a program often means converging quantitative and qualitative data, looking at the impact. So when Fong was putting up these different reasons for doing humanitarian evaluation projects, I was actually saying, okay, that's that design, that's that design, that's that design. So we have a terminology I'll be introducing you to here. Following up the impact, explanatory sequential design. So we're going to do a survey and then follow up with some interviews. We might look at both process and outcomes. During an intervention trial, we might collect both interviews as well as experimental outcome data. Program implementation, following up after, as Fong was talking about, after the intervention is over, following up qualitatively. So now we're beginning to spin out a number of models for doing mixed method. Program intervention, where we conduct some interviews before an intervention trial. So my master class here at Harvard was over in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. I had a lot of global health people in that class. And they were convinced that you just can't go into Rwanda and drop in a depression instrument. No, you've got to go in and do some kind of needs assessment to see what might actually work with the people. So that's doing some interviews before you actually bring some instruments and intervention in. It's a really important use of mixed methods research in this field of humanitarian research. What's the value of mixed methods in this program? It certainly gives you more evidence. You're collecting quantitative and qualitative. You can better use that evidence. You might gain some new insights. So when you start bringing your quantitative and qualitative together, there are some new insights that will emerge. For example, in that Bolton article, when they added qualitative free listing interviews in, they got some new insights to improve that survey instrument. You can explore the needs a little bit more, and you can explain results. I'm going to go into some of these in more detail. So what is mixed methods? It's really a very simple idea. I think all good ideas are very simple ideas anyway that start out. It's using quantitative and qualitative data together to gain a more complete understanding of our research questions. So if you're doing survey work and you're doing interviews and you're keeping those analyses separately, you have a missed opportunity of bringing the two together to gain additional insight. So a more formal definition here would be, it's an approach investigating behavior, social, and health-related problems, collecting and analyzing quantitative and qualitative data in response to questions, of course, and then integrating or mixing the two to generate new and more complete insights than those obtained from either quantitative or qualitative data alone. So by bringing the statistics about the Boston bombing together with the stories, there are more insights than what you might gain from just looking at each one separately. Now, you know, methodologies are continually changing and evolving. You know, participatory research prior to the 1990s, we really didn't even know about that. Meta-analysis before 1970 was an unknown aspect of quantitative research. So these are continually evolving. New ones are coming about. And you know, quantitative probably started way back at the beginning of the 1900s. In the social sciences, qualitative research probably came in about the 1950s, although anthropologists would tell me these anthropologists were doing so-called ethnographic qualitative research back at the turn of the century. But in the social science, when did qualitative come into the health sciences? You know, I think it came in about 1990. Crabtree and Miller's book on qualitative research was one of the first to actually bridge the two. So I put qualitative more into this arena. Now, mixed methods, on the other hand, is even newer yet. It's the newest methodology to come along, I think. That's been given quite a bit of publicity. So, for example, one of my students did a search of dissertations that had mixed methods in the title, 3 of them in 1984. Between this time period, 2,524. And my colleague, Plano Clark, says that number is over 6,000 right now in this last year. So, continues to go up. And NIH funding that have the words mixed methods in it. Now, this is not a large number given all the projects they fund, but it's on the upswing more and more. And probably since our guidelines on mixed methods came out in the summer of 2011, and this is called the Best Practices in Mixed Methods Research. It's across all the institutes and centers. Within 3 weeks, it became the most heavily hit website at NIH. So there's tremendous interest across a lot of the health areas right now. This can all be tracked back about 25 years ago. There were 8 people that came up with the idea that we might begin thinking about how to bring quantitative and qualitative together. Qualitative was being accepted more and more in the social sciences. Jennifer Green was an evaluator. There were a couple of sociologists, a management professor, myself, some sociologists. There was one health researcher, Jan Morse, who was operating out of the University of Alberta. They started working in mixed methods way back at the beginning as well. So Fong referred to me as the father of mixed methods. We can't use that word. It's the founder. You know, moved to a less gender-based term here. But I was probably one of the early people into the field. So we can track some of the events that have occurred as this methodology is unfolding. And I think Alan Bryman was one of the first. He wrote a book on quantitative and qualitative. And Jennifer Green, she wrote it was a journal article on evaluation where she specified some of the mixed methods designs. Tasha Corey and Ted Lay wrote a book in 1998 on mixed methodology. They began to define the field in 2003. So that's just a little over 10 years ago that this methodology began picking up. And then at Leeds, you're at Leeds, where they've had for the last few years the international conference. That started in 2006. This journal started, that I co-edited, started in 2007. And then we had, in 2011, the NIH guidelines on best practices in mixed methods research come out. And finally, just this month, a new international association it's called Mixed Methods International Research Association is starting up. You know, to me, these are kind of the events that have been unfolding in this mixed methods field. So what's happened in 25 years is we've actually come up with techniques or strategies in what I would call the science of mixed methods research. And we'll be focusing in on some of these techniques. What do you want to know? For example, designing a good study aim, a mixed methods study aim, using quantitative and qualitative data, the different forms of data that we could use, using rigorous methods. And so that's adding to the systematic evaluation part, involving stakeholders. We've been thinking a lot about how to integrate this data. I mean, if you have, like from the Boston bombing, you have those numbers, and then you have stories, text. How do you put the two together? So coming up with strategies for how to integrate the two. Talking about the different types of designs. So we have different ways of doing mixed methods research. In the same sense, we've got different ways of doing quantitative research. You know, we've got true randomized control trials, we've got quasi-experimental designs, we've got single subject designs, we've got surveys. In the qualitative area, we have different forms of qualitative research, don't we? How about case studies? Ethnographies.
Grounded research.
Grounded theory projects. We have the different types, so qualitative expanded, so it's no great surprise that we have different types of designs that have emerged in mixed methods. And sometimes these designs are framed within some larger theoretical perspective, such as an intervention trial, like Fong was showing us. We can picture these designs. That's a great innovation. Because when you're gathering both quantitative and qualitative data, you have several types of data collection, data analysis flowing into your project. Now, how are you going to convince your stakeholder out there in the Congo or your funding agent of the value of this project? You could talk to them about, I'm collecting quantitative first and then following up with some interviews, and this is how the two are going to intersect. Or you could draw a picture. And this all started about 10 years ago when an NIH project officer said to me, John, we like mixed methods research, but basically it's too complex. People have this qualitative, quantitative flowing throughout the project. And so that's when we started drawing pictures or diagrams. So we'll spend some, and for your mixed methods project that you're going to be spinning out in here, we'll have you draw a diagram. And then the interesting thing is, once we know what these designs are, it's opened up this whole arena of understanding what some of the challenges, or if you want to call this validity threats. Anyone familiar? Now this is really an old book. Maybe it dates me. But Campbell and Stanley's book on experimental and quasi-experimental designs back in the 1960s. What that book did was it set the stage for how we do experiments. That's lasted to today. But more importantly, what that book did was it identified the designs, and then it said, here are your potential threats to validity that you need to pay attention to if you do these designs. So we follow that same mode of thinking, potential challenges. Now, one of the innovations too in mixed methods is how do you start picturing your results together? So we have this term called joint displays, where we can array our quantitative and qualitative side by side and actually see the differences. For example, in doing a humanitarian project, you can gather some survey data where people rate on a scale responses, say about depression. But you can then also interview some people where they tell you their stories. Now, aren't you curious as to whether those two forms of evidence are similar or different? And how can you picture them side by side to really look at these differences? So a joint display has come along. Another part in this technique or the science of mixed methods is begin thinking about the questions we ask. And we've actually innovated in a new type of question that you won't find in any research methods book in the world, probably except some of the mixed methods that are coming out now. And that is a mixed methods question that you're attempting to ask with a particular design. So we'll get into writing a mixed methods question for your project in here. So here's some of the ways. People have been doing evaluation for years, but using some of these techniques of integration and design and picturing it and challenges and joint displays, and this is all new stuff. In fact, mostly in the mixed methods field, it's within the last 10 years. So for example, to break those points down, and what we're going to do as we work on your projects is take them into a deeper level. So right now I'm just going to introduce some of the ideas. What do you want to know? You write a purpose statement that sets forth the basic intent of the assessment, what you want to accomplish at the end. So these two projects in the Bolton article, I pulled out their purpose statement. Proposed evaluation was first used in a post-disaster setting to explore expected and unexpected impacts of a program that showed films to refugees in a large refugee camp. I think it's important to have this study aim very clear so we know what you're doing. And this is another one from Uganda here. So what type of qualitative and quantitative data will you collect? Now, this requires an understanding of the two forms of data and what some of the distinctions might be. And sometimes those distinctions are hard to really separate. In a health setting, you could have a patient record that is both qualitative, but also then provides some of the tests the person has completed, their blood work, and so it could have both quantitative and qualitative to it. Quantitative, though, tends to be more objective, numbers-oriented. Information gathered when participants check their responses to close-ended response options. In other words, when there's response possibilities that you as a researcher or some instrument provide, close-ended. This is a big distinction for me between quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative is more subjective, words or images. And people often look at qualitative as just text information, words. But there's this whole array of qualitative forms of data out there that are image. For example, videotapes, photographs, objects. It's based on gathering information to open-ended questions where participants are not given response categories. So some people think about quantitative as numbers, and that was my bombing example, and qualitative as stories, but for me, a more nuanced understanding is open-ended versus closed-ended. And so you tell me you want to collect some sounds of people crying in a refugee camp. Do you give them response categories to that, or are you just listening and categorizing what those sounds are in an open-ended way? So that's how I would distinguish these two databases. We know in an impact assessment there's a lot of different approaches to how we might collect data that run from economic assessments to observation, community forums, photo elicitation, videotapes, meetings from board, correspondence. We have a lot. And to think about some way to organize these is helpful. And so what I talk about in qualitative data collection, we can do open-ended interviews, observations, documents, use audiovisual materials. And over here on the quantitative side, we can gather instrument data, observational behavioral checklists, and we can rely on records. Now, when you look at the quantitative sources of data, it's much narrower than the qualitative. In my qualitative book, I have this compendium of qualitative sources. I'm continually enlarging it. For example, email messages, text messages, website, main pages, sounds, videotapes. Qualitative is growing, whereas I would say in the quantitative arena, it's a rather stable set of sources of data. And then we've got to know something about how we're going to analyze that qualitative data. You know, going through this process of coding and theme development. Over on the quantitative, you know, we are probably more familiar with descriptive analysis and comparing groups using the analysis of variance and relating variables. That's going to run, you know, from your correlation to very sophisticated structural equation model, longitudinal modeling, growth models. Logistic regression is used a lot in the health sciences. I had a medical doctor, I was speaking to the Robert Wood Johnson faculty fellows at the national meeting, and a doctor said to me, okay, John, I'm a busy provider. What's the minimum I need to know and to do mixed methods research? And I said, well, really you need to know how to collect qualitative data and how to analyze it, and collect quantitative and analyze it. Or you need to join a team, because often people may not have both of these skill sets in their background. People that get into my mixed methods course at Nebraska, they have quantitative courses and they have qualitative courses, just like what Dennison was talking about, and then they come into the mixed methods, prepared to do mixed methods. Another element of mixed methods research would be the rigorous methods and involving stakeholders. Now, there's this thought out there that because I'm gathering both quantitative and qualitative data and analyzing it, that means that maybe I can be less rigorous with one of the databases than the other. But really, the more, the good publishable, research-oriented mixed methods projects have rigor on both sides. So what does this involve? I put together a short list of rigorous procedures: sampling, recruitment, sample size, forms of data collection, how you're going to record the data, how you're going to transcribe, store the data, especially using software, how you're going to clean up the database in some type of initial analysis and advanced analysis. So when articles would come in to the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, one of the primary factors for assessing the rigor of those scientific studies was to look down their methods and to see if they had a fairly good discussion of both the quantitative and qualitative methods areas. There's probably more, and there is more, than this. This is a short list, but this might be a starter. And then if they're involving stakeholders, you know, there are a lot of books being written out on community participatory action research or participatory research, and how you should engage the stakeholders. And the primary argument seems to be, of all the books I've read, been reading some of the recent ones, is that you involve those stakeholders in many phases of the research process, and the more phases, the better. There are some studies out there that are mixed methods that involve the stakeholders in helping to identify questions, set the goals, set the topics for data collection, design the instruments, work with recommendations, changes, maybe even setting up a committee and task force toward the end. So in your mixed methods project, your key component is how are you going to involve stakeholders if you're going to bring them into your humanitarian project. Now this issue of how we're going to integrate the two forms of data, this is a big issue. This is one that perplexes most people because they've never heard of this idea before. How do you bring in numeric data and text data together? It's really looking at the ways these two can intersect. There's a term in the mixed methods research called the point of integration. So if I draw out a picture of my mixed methods project, I can draw an arrow to the point of integration, where these two are beginning to interface. One is to actually merge the data, bring the two databases together. Another is to have one database build on the other. Another is to have one database explain the other. Another is to embed the data. And I'm going to show you examples of these when we get into your project, because I'll need to know how you're going to begin integrating in your particular study. So here's a picture of this integration. We could bring the quantitative data, such as a survey, and the qualitative, such as an interview, together in the results section. We could start your mixed methods project with a qualitative exploration. I gave you the example of that depression instrument being brought into the Congo or Sierra Leone. My colleague Teresa over in public health here starts all of her projects this way. She wants to get a cultural understanding before she brings in instruments. So you explore first, then you develop an instrument that's sensitive, and then you test it out. See how that builds sequentially? She also does a lot of work where she explores and then develops an intervention that might actually work with the people she's studying. This is an important model in global health and humanitarian research. Another one, and this is a very easy one to implement, and one that's often overlooked, and that is to first gather quantitative survey results. And we know when we do a survey that there are some interesting findings that remain unexplained if we stop right there. But what if you were to choose some of those interesting findings and then go talk to some people to help explain why that result came out? It's called an explanatory sequential mixed methods design. When I did an analysis of the mixed method studies in the trauma research area, this was the primary design being used. When I did last week, when I presented to the community researchers here at Harvard, I looked at their community research projects. Most of them were of this form, bringing this. It hadn't even occurred to them that this might be a good model. And yet I'm over at the Massachusetts Department of Health presenting to all these commissioners on mixed methods research. They were actually describing a survey that they had conducted and were pointing out all the unusual findings that they were coming up with. And they stopped right there. They didn't follow up qualitatively. This is a powerful model. It's a very simple one to implement in a humanitarian situation. Another is what Fong brought in, actually, is you put that qualitative data into more of a quantitative design, like an intervention experiment. And qualitative can flow in before the experiment, as she illustrated in that one example, during or after. I believe that the way to do good systematic research is design a mixed method study. That doesn't mean that it's fixed forever. It could be emerging, and you'll see these emerging mixed methods projects. But we've done a lot of work simplifying how we talk about these designs. And I think this is an innovation that's come forward just the last couple of years. There are basic designs and advanced designs. And at the heart of really all the mixed methods projects are these three designs. We call this one a convergent, where we're going to bring these two databases together. I think this is often used in program assessment. Or we're going to look at the impact of a program, gather quantitative data, and then explain it with qualitative data. Or we're going to start qualitatively to explore and then build something like an intervention or an instrument, and then quantitatively test this out. Exploratory sequential design. So when you think about mixed methods designs, start with your project. Which one of the three best fits your project. This one is used when we want to gather multiple perspectives from different stakeholders. And oftentimes we can do some survey work and we can do some interview, and then we put the results together to have a more complete understanding of the problem. Because when you talk to people, you get the in-depth picture. When you send out a survey, you get the more general trends. And so putting those two together, we really want to understand. Sometimes this is used when we don't know what the quantitative measures are. I've got an NSF project over here in Boston, in Walton, where they came up with some measures, quantitative measures from the literature, and they just didn't know whether they were measuring it right. There weren't good discussions of what these measures might be. They then gathered qualitative data, and so the qualitative really helped them understand how they needed to reshape those measures to better assess them. This one is often used when you have a quantitative orientation and you need to explain some of those surprising, unusual results. Get a more in-depth understanding. You could measure that, you could administer that depression instrument, but then to follow up with some qualitative interviews to understand really why are the people depressed. And this one is often used when you're exploring first in a cultural group or another country where you really need to be contextually sensitive to what's going on. Now, mixed methods is no more complicated than these three, actually, in many cases. They're at the heart of all the mixed methods projects. You can add some additional features, and so the way I picture it is to frame one of those three designs within a larger framework. This framework could be an experiment, a theory, a social justice theory, a process of involving stakeholders. It could be, somebody mentioned geocoding. Geocoding could be a framework surrounding one of these three basic designs. Is important. So here we have our basic design, and we're going to frame it within one of these larger frameworks. And these are just three examples. And so this is the example that Fong showed us earlier. What we've got going here, when you study this one carefully, the main idea is to follow up their intervention and to understand those outcome results. So this part right here looms really large in this project. So would that be exploratory sequential or explanatory sequential? So you're explaining the quantitative intervention results. So this part right here is an explanatory sequential. But you see the whole thing is framed within an intervention trial. So it really has two layers to me. It's basically an explanatory sequential design framed within an intervention trial. Now, you're probably hearing about designs for the first time, but you can read some of these mixed methods books where you are buried into multiple 10, 20 different types of designs. And I really don't think it's any more complex than this. So what you do in your project is think about what's your basic design. That's where we're going to start. I'm going to have you draw a picture of it. And then for some of you, you may want to frame it within an intervention model. Now, this picture was not in their article, but we drew it. And having a picture, now you can see, you can actually use this with stakeholders. You can use this with funding agents. This is a picture of my overall design, so you can draw these diagrams, and that's what I'm going to be emphasizing. This is a study by Grayson, just came out last year, where they put the framework of CBPR, community-based research, as a framework around a convergent design. Now in this project, they gathered some preliminary qualitative data, but here is the mixed methods part. They had a survey instrument with both closed and open-ended questions on it. Now, for a lot of the medical doctors I work with, this is an efficient design because they can't get out to the field more than once. It's not rigorous qualitative data, but yet it does represent qualitative data. They then merged, they compared the results of these two lines of questioning here. But throughout this study, they had this community involvement flowing. So the question, if you're going to use a basic design within a community-based framework, how are you going to involve the community? And in Grayson's article, they have a whole section on here's how the community was involved at the various stages. So they're tying it right to the research process. Now, another framework is to put this within a large-scale, multi-year evaluation project of a program. So Natazi and colleagues did a study of the mental health of youth in Sri Lanka. It was an NIH-funded project. It lasted 3 years. And first they had a conceptual picture. They looked at the theory and proposed a model, did some preliminary formative research, developed a theory, and then came up with an instrument which they then tested out, evaluated the success of it, then they modified the theory. So they actually had this diagram in their article. But what they were doing is flowing between quantitative and qualitative research at each one of the stages here. So the way we talk about this type of mixed method design, it's a multi-stage design with a single program objective, understanding the mental health of youth, with multiple quantitative and qualitative studies and some mixed method studies flowing throughout it. We don't know a lot about these designs, but I would think in the humanitarian area they would be pretty important. Again, I've been starting to show you some pictures of the diagrams of this. So how do you draw a picture of your design? This is a convergent design. Can you see where the two are coming together? It really has 3 levels of analysis going on. Here's the general flow of ideas. And then at each step, the researchers would identify procedures. And then because this was a project for funders, they listed products at each stage. So there's really 3 elements that can build into these pictures. And if you start turning to the mixed methods literature in some of the leading, like the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, you'll see pictures like this. You may also see something like this. So this started quantitatively and moved to qualitative. What type of design do we have there? Quantitative followed by qualitative. Explanatory sequential design. Now, by being able to picture the designs in kind of a flow chart like this, which is another way that we can picture a design, we can also begin thinking about some of the challenges. And the key challenge in this design, first of all, this is an extremely popular graduate student design. It's very easy to implement. It often is done by people that have a stronger quantitative background because you're starting quantitatively, following up qualitative. You could have a large N in your quantitative and a smaller N in the qualitative, so it's manageable. But by being able to picture this design, we can see where the challenges might be. For example, when you analyze your quantitative data, what results do you really build on? Significant relationships, non-significant relationships, outliers, some combination of demographics as well as important predictors. It's a key decision, and there are many options. And so reading the mixed methods literature, begin to see those options. And then the other part of this is, who are the people that are going to help answer these qualitative questions? Say you found that, just certain types of humanitarian workers responded in a negative way. You may want to just select those people and look at their negative responses to this program. So that's a key. So being able to design these pictures, now we can focus in. I can tell you what the challenges are going to be to this. So if you're going to follow up qualitatively on this quantitative database, are these people different or the same? So it makes sense in this case to choose qualitative people that were in the quantitative first phase, right? To best understand, not move to a different. So knowing that kind of helps you think about who you're going to choose. You often report the results separately, and you need to explain in the discussion how the qualitative really explains the quantitative. So what we've been able to do is to map onto these designs validity issues that might render the results inaccurate. Now, another thing we've done is we've thought a lot about how to put these two databases together, regardless of design. A joint display is an array of the quantitative and qualitative results in a table or a graph. So, for example, you could collect GIS-coded data and have a map, couldn't you? And you could have a pull-out on each one of the, say, counties in this state map and indicate the qualitative themes. So you could pull out all of those qualitative themes and start comparing the counties, couldn't you? There you've brought together qualitative and geocoded information in a map. A very simple procedure would be in a convergent design where you're asking the same question. Let's say you've got some questions that are being asked, and you're gathering data through face-to-face interviews and a telephone survey, and you can actually compare the results to each one of your questions. Side by side, a joint display. Now you could also have a column over here that talks about the differences between those responses, couldn't you? So in the NSF project over in Walden, they're using a table just like this. This came from some authors writing in 2000. But we're getting a lot of different pictures on how to do a joint display. So my colleague Joe Gallo down at Hopkins, I was just with him working, he thinks that and it's a good idea, that you can put together a joint display that shows the overall approach in your research project. Here's your strategy, here's your sample, here's your goal, here's your analysis. So you're trying to convince funding people to fund your project. Put together a table, a joint display like this, of these different elements of your project. Or I always say, if you're a graduate student presenting to your committee, this is a good example of how these things all interconnect. So here's an article in Health Promotion Area by Klassen. When you turn to their results section, they're doing a convergent model and bringing the two together too, but they're doing it in a discussion. They're talking about the idea of previous motor vehicle convictions. This is for older adults, older driver safety. Here are the quantitative results, here are the qualitative results, and here's how the two could be compared. So I call this a side-by-side discussion, mixed methods discussion. So the question, when you've got quantitative data and qualitative, how do you actually merge it? Here they've just merged it in a discussion section, and they pointed out the differences. Now, they could go even one step further that we talked about in the mixed methods. Knowing that these two databases can be compared, there could be another section down here explaining those differences. What explains those differences? Was the qualitative data maybe not, analysis not as good? Were the constructs questionable, and were the instruments questionable? And then finally, mixed methods, we have begun thinking about a new type of research question. So the whole idea is, in mixed method study is to write, and you'll do this for your project, write a quantitative question, write a qualitative question, and write the mixed methods question that relates to your design. And I'll bring this back when we go into our design a little bit more, but what are qualitative questions hoping to answer? What are quantitative? And to understand that the mixed methods is a combination of these two. And how we word this question is going to be important. So, a convergent design. To what extent do the quantitative and qualitative results converge? Are they similar? So now we could take this into the humanitarian context. To what extent do the survey results, looking at the impact of this program, whether they are similar with the views of people's experiences who've gone through the program? What ways do the qualitative data help explain? What ways do the quantitative results generalize the qualitative findings? So techniques in the science of emerging mixed methods research. How to write purpose statements. How to identify clearly the types of data. Can you identify the quantitative and qualitative data for your project? How to make it rigorous. How to think about where these two databases are integrate and a reason for that integration. Choosing a design. Working from this idea of a basic design first, and then adding a framework into it. Drawing a diagram of the design. Some validity challenges in the design. Joint displays and mixed methods questions. That's going to be a starting point. I'm going to add a few more points in, like writing a title for your project. This isn't any ordinary title. This will be a mixed methods title. And we'll go about writing that. Now these designs, we'll keep them simple. We'll start with the basic design and then work out to a larger framework. But to show you how complicated they can get, the R24 that was just funded that I'm working on with Teresa Benacourt in the School of Public Health here, she had an exploratory sequential design, surrounded by an intervention design, surrounded by a community participatory design. 3 levels to conceptualize her project. And I'm going to show her a picture of her design here, how she drew it out in her actual application. So, you have a sense of what mixed methods is all about here? It's kind of exciting, isn't it? I think what I'll end up doing is maybe enlarging your repertoire of how you think about using your quantitative and qualitative data. I will advance perhaps your thinking about how to gain more insight out of your data, to mine it a little bit more. I'll be working with you to develop some pictures so that you can take those pictures to your stakeholders and say, here's what we're doing. So this isn't just random quantitative and qualitative flowing together. And ultimately we'll think about, what does this really add over just gathering the statistics of the bombing or just gathering the stories? How do we have some additional insight that's beginning to emerge here in mixed methods?